evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Here tonight, as I often am these days, with my wonderful friend and colleague, David Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester, Vermont. Before we get started, a couple of very quick notes. First of all, you may have noticed as you came in that this meeting is being recorded for future broadcast on our YouTube channel. However, fear not, if you want to have your camera on, you may. We have this set up so that we will only be recording those of us who are unmuted and speaking into the yellow box. So you can have your camera on and you will not appear on YouTube for perpetuity. In light of that, please use the chat box to ask any questions that you might have. You can pose them there at any point during the evening. We will have time for audience questions at the end of the night, and David and I will save them up and pose them for you when we get to the end. So make use of that chat box whenever you like. And then last of all, before I turn things over to David to introduce our guest tonight, a word of thanks to all of you. Indie bookselling is a strange and hard business in any time, and it has not been the best of times to be a small business this last year and a half. And Northshire's continued existence is really owed to the incredible loyalty and support of customers like you. We couldn't do what we do without you, and we are incredibly grateful for that continued support. We know it's been a lot of effort. And so thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting us. And without further ado, David, why don't you introduce our guest tonight?
Thank you so much, Rachel. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to Northshire Nancy Marie Brown for her new book, The Real Valkyrie, The Hidden History of Viking Warrior Women. She writes about Iceland and Vikings, science and sagas. Her books combine extremes, medieval literature and modern archaeology, myths and facts. She's the author of 7 books, including the Northshire Staff Picks, The Far Traveler, Voyages of a Viking Woman, and Ivory Vikings, The Mystery of the Most Famous Chessmen in the World and the Woman Who Made Them. Her latest book, The Real Valkyrie, has been called stirring, passionate, and an amazing book offering nothing less than a paradigm shift. Northshire Saratoga bookseller Maeve said in her staff review that Brown's gift is her own ability to tell a great story and not lose sight of facts. She is a true scald history keeper. We are very lucky tonight to be joined by historical fiction novelist Linnea Hartsuyker, author of the acclaimed Golden Wolf trilogy, comprised of The Half-Drowned King, The Sea Queen, and The Golden Wolf, also Northshire Staff Picks. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Linnea Hartsuyker and Nancy Marie Brown. Why don't y'all get started?
All right. I'm so excited to be doing this event tonight with Nancy. Even before I read The Real Valkyrie, I was a huge fan of her books. All of you who haven't read The Song of the Vikings, the book about Snorri Sturluson, until I read this one, that was my favorite. Snorri is such a character. But we're not here to talk about Snorri. We're here to talk about Viking women that he may have maligned. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Nancy to do a reading, and then we'll do a discussion.
Thank you, Linnea. I think we probably will hear about Snorri Sturluson sometime later, but I'm going to start off with a short reading from the introduction of The Real Valkyrie. This is called The Valkyrie's Grave. All I have are her bones. I don't know her name or precisely where or when she was born. I don't know how she died, though bones often do betray such secrets. All I have are her bones. Now boxed and stored in a museum in Sweden, bones gathered by an archaeologist in 1878 from a grave beside a hill fort overlooking the Viking town of Birka, where she was buried in the mid-10th century in a spacious, wood-lined pit. To tell her story, all I have are her bones, and what was unearthed with her: an axe blade, 2 spearheads, a 2-edged sword, a clutch of arrows, their shafts embellished with silver thread, a long sax knife in a bronze-ringed sheath, iron bosses for 2 round shields, a short-bladed knife, a whetstone, a set of game pieces bundled in her lap, a large bronze bowl much repaired, a comb, a snip of a silver coin, 3 trader's weights, 2 stirrups, 2 bridle's bits and spikes to ride a horse on the ice. along with the bones of 2 horses, a stallion and a mare. Of her clothing, all that remains are an iron cloak pin, a filigreed silver cone, 4 baubles or buttons of coiled silver wire, strips of silk embroidered with silver, and a scattering of mirrored sequins. Until 2017, when DNA tests proved the bones were female, this grave, numbered BJ 581, was held up as the classic Viking warrior's grave. Quote, "The position of the skeleton," wrote a Swedish archaeologist in 1966, "gave the impression that he had been sitting in the grave rather than laid out. The equipment indicates that this is a warrior's grave rather than that of a merchant. The date of a silver coin found underneath the skeleton of the dead man provides a fairly good idea of the date of the grave, 913 to 980 AD. The implications of the dead man turning into a dead woman dazzle me. They ignite my imagination. A burial with weapons and horses, an archaeologist claimed as late as 2008, used a widely recognized symbolic language of lordship, one that was unquestionably masculine. To assume all such weapons graves are male now seems to me to be a mistake, one that has skewed our image of the Viking Age. How does history change if we turn that assumption on its head? There are other ways to interpret the grave, other ways to explain a female body buried with weapons, but the simplest seems to me to be the most likely. Defending their findings in 2019, the team that tested her DNA said BJ 581, quote, "suggests to us that at least one Viking Age woman adopted a professional warrior lifestyle." They added, "We would be very surprised if she was alone in the Viking world." So that's how I begin The Real Valkyrie, the hidden history of Viking warrior women.
Well, I think that's a great introduction to what the book ends up being, which is this this narrative of that you imagine, but also illustrate with a lot of research and scholarship of what the life of this Viking warrior woman could have been like. And it's also like a really wonderful tour of, it's a tour of women in the Viking world and just a tour of the Viking world. So it actually would be a great book for someone who doesn't know much about Vikings to start with. But I wanted to ask what made you decide to write the book as a narrative with these sort of fictionalized passages rather than just a fully straightforward history?
Well, the idea to write this book came to me sometime in like 2015, and it has evolved over the years quite a bit. It actually came out of my previous book, Ivory Vikings, which is a story of the Lewis chessmen and a woman in Iceland named Margaret, who was known as the best ivory carver of her time. And I trace an argument that she may have actually made the Lewis chessmen, these very famous little, beautiful little chess pieces. Actually, I think I have one here. I can even show you one. So this is one of the little Lewis chessmen. There are queens in that chess set. And in the 10th century, when chess came from the Middle East, from the Arabic world, the piece in that spot was a man. It was a vizier. So one of the questions that I tried to talk about in Ivory Vikings was, why did the queen catch on in 10th century Europe? And some of the things that I mused about in that chapter were, well, maybe because there were some very famous queens in Scandinavia at that time, including Gunhild, Mother of Kings, who was Queen of Norway. Or maybe it had something to do with the Valkyries and the shield maids in Norse mythology and in the Icelandic sagas. And this woman, Margaret, the ivory carver, was living in Iceland when the sagas were first starting to be written. So she would have known these stories of Valkyries and of important forceful, powerful queens. So that got me to thinking, well, maybe the Valkyries are real. Maybe there really were women on the battlefield like there were women on the chessboard. Maybe it wasn't a big leap for them to see women in a war game. So as I do in most of my books, I thought, okay, I want to add to the history and the saga some archaeology. And the big question that I wanted to answer was, how do we know a buried warrior was male or female? What is the science of gendering graves and gendering warriors? So I looked up Neil Price, who was one of the experts in this field, and I arranged to meet him in Orlando, Florida, at a conference early in 2016. And I asked him if he could recommend a grave that I could study. And I told him I was thinking about writing a book on Valkyries, and I really would be interested in studying a burial that could be a woman warrior. And I would really like it best if the archaeologist involved was also a woman. And Neil's eyes are getting bigger and bigger, and he's looking at me like, how could you possibly know this? And he said, I can't talk about that yet. And I went, okay, I have stumbled on something here. And he said, but if you can put off your idea for about a year, there's a study coming out that's going to change the conversation. So I went back to my, sagas and mythology and learned everything I could about Valkyries, waiting to see, okay, what is this study that's going to change the conversation? And that came out in September 2017. It was called A Female Viking Warrior Confirmed by Genomics. And it was confirmed because bone specialists who had looked at this grave had wondered, those look like female bones. How could this great warrior surrounded by weapons be female? Well, when they did a DNA test, they found out, yes, indeed, she was. So there was my combination. There were my sagas and my archaeology. And I thought then, okay, this is going to be a book about bones. This is going to be a book about new technologies in archaeology and what they can teach us about gender roles in the Viking Age. And, maybe this warrior is, a Valkyrie. Well, then this backlash from scholars in the field hit. And they said, oh, the science must be wrong because we know women couldn't be warriors in the Viking Age. And the scientists actually came out with a second study in 2019 where they went into a whole lot more detail. But by then I was halfway through writing the book, because when I saw that they were questioning the science, I realized, oh, this isn't a book about bones. This isn't a book about archaeology. This is a book about bias. This is a book about how does history depend on our assumptions, and how does it change if we change our assumptions? So I knew there was going to be a lot of speculation in this book when I started writing it, and I knew I was going to be telling a lot of stories about Valkyries and queens and people. And I wrote the first draft and turned it in 2019, I guess. And my editor and I were very much in agreement that the woman, the Valkyrie, was still hidden. She was still in the shadows. And so I said, well, I have kind of pushed the speculation as far as I can go by, trying to get everything I can find out about this skeleton. And the only way I can actually bring her to life is with fiction. And my editor said, go for it. So what I ended up doing was using essentially the same technique that we're used to from documentary filmmaking these days, where I had interviews with a lot of experts, I had a lot of historical material, I had a lot of science, but then I had the actors dress up in period costumes and actually reenact some scene. So I started each chapter with historical fiction, and then I backed up and explained my sources. And I tried to be very clear what was fiction and what was my sources, and fact and speculation, because some of it isn't. I mean, you can't really find facts for a lot of things that are 1,000 years ago. But one of the readers who got in touch with me just after the book came out said I was actually giving a master class on how to write historical fiction. And I really liked that, because I kind of go back and forth between these two genres. But you, as a historical fiction writer, I'm sure is going to know that my fiction is maybe not great fiction. It's
Well, I think they're wonderful descriptive passages. So for like, in terms of evoking a historical world, I think they do that job really well, and a historical person. And that's kind of the job of those pieces. You're sort of
Right,
like
right.
dipping in and then coming back out again. It's a really wonderful way to structure it. And even like, I was slightly skeptical for the first chapter, and then I got really fell into the rhythm of,
Good.
and it's fairly short chapters, which like, it just propels you along from piece to piece of her story, interspersing these things. It's really wonderful and hard to put down. I kind of had to force myself to read it slower so that I wouldn't like, so that it would be, I would remember it more. Because sometimes if I race through a book, I'm like, well, that was great. What happened?
Yeah. Well, that
So-
was really the hardest part of incorporating the fiction and the nonfiction, because what I ended up doing was taking my original draft of the book and cutting it into, I mean, it had been like 9 chapters, and I cut it into about 48 pieces of individual ideas or themes or sections. And then I looked at those and I said, which ones of these are better told in fiction? And which ones of these have to be in nonfiction? And then I had to reorganize everything so that I could start out with fiction. And I think I ended up with 15 or so chapters, shorter chapters, so that each one could start with a fictional scene and then we could back up, because I really wanted it to have that rhythm where the reader knew exactly what was coming when they got to the end of a chapter. Like, okay, now we're going to have a story, and then you're going to learn something.
Yeah, it works really well. And I'm so glad you did this project, because I was always like tickled the back of my mind that the way that graves are sexed is it's like circular logic. Like, if it has
Yeah.
a sword, it must be a man's grave. Therefore, this other grave I found that has a sword in it must belong to a man. And it's like, if you make all those assumptions, then every grave you find with a sword must be a man. And as a woman who's 6 feet tall and lifts weights, if they bury me and they lose my hips, they're going to think I'm a man too, unless they sex my my
Well, as
bones.
long as you get that sword in your grave, you got to make sure you get that. That was something that just shocked me so much, because as you mentioned in the introduction, I've written a book about women in the Viking Age before. I mean, I wrote about the Far Traveler, and she was an exceptional woman who went to North America during the Viking Age. But I had accepted all these assumptions about what women could do and what men could do. And then when I looked into the science, the archaeology of how they gender graves, and started reading, a lot of PhD theses on the fringes of this kind of work, I discovered from one of these theses that the idea of what she called sexing by metal, and I use that term in my book, of if there's a sword in the grave, it must be a man. That idea first came into the field in the 1830s. Now, this was before you even had a science of archaeology, before you even had a concept of Viking studies. I mean, the idea of the Viking Age was hardly even invented by 1830. It was still Iron Age Scandinavia. And so this idea is so deeply rooted in our understanding of the Vikings and in all the history books. It's just based on the assumption that, of course, men are the ones with swords. Nobody actually gathered the statistics to prove this. So, I mean, probably it's true that most of them are, but the fact that there is at least one now that is proven to be female makes me just like really want somebody to go back and retest every single bone they can. And of course, you can't get DNA out of most bones because they're just not in good enough shape. So it's a very time-consuming and expensive process, and we can't really hope that every grave is going to get sexed that way these days. But if a few more do, it's just really going to change our understanding, I think, of what can women do. Like you said, you're 6 feet tall. You should not be compared to a man who's 5'5". If a man who's 5'5" can be a warrior, you can certainly be a warrior.
There's and one thing that I loved about this book, and I would want you to go to explain a little bit further, is how that 1830s and that Victorian way of looking at the evidence has led historians to interpret every bit of evidence we have about the Viking Age through the lens of these warrior women in the literature couldn't be real.
Yeah.
So yes, I wanted to ask more about your research process. I was really thrilled to note that you even talked to, people who are women warriors now.
Yeah. I was lucky to know the people down at Hurstwick in Massachusetts. It's a Viking fighting school and reenactors, and I kept wanting to go down and do one of the Viking training sessions down there, and I could never quite work it out in terms of the timing. But I went down actually when one of the lead researchers on this the BJ 581 study was doing a lecture in the area, and they gave me a private lesson in Viking fighting techniques. And because they knew what book I was working on, the person who was my sparring partner was their woman warrior, and oh man, was she good. She was not that much bigger than me, but she was younger, so I can excuse myself that way. But she was so well balanced and so fast, and actually a number of the men in the group said, oh yeah, she beats us all the time. She's just good at this. And it was just so neat to see, in real life, oh yeah, of course women can do this, and they can do it as well as the men, and they can do it better than men who are, not trained. That's for sure. But certainly she did it a whole lot better than me. And I've talked to a few other women who are, in Viking reenacting groups and in training, and seen some films about their work. And they really don't have a problem with it, and the men don't have a problem with it once the woman reaches a certain level of training. It's like any martial art. If you can actually do it, if you are willing to put yourself physically on the line and build yourself up, like you said, you're a weightlifter. Well, you can compete with other weightlifters of the same ability level. And when a woman warrior proves herself, then she's as good as a man. I mean, there's not really shouldn't be a question that way.
Yeah, actually, something we say in weightlifting is strength is a skill.
Yeah.
And being large isn't even always an advantage.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Smaller people tend to be faster, and that really matters when you're fighting.
Absolutely.
So now that you've researched and written The Real Valkyrie, how would you answer the question, what is a Valkyrie? And how has that answer changed from before and now?
I'm not sure it changed so much as I expanded it. As you pointed out, I've written a biography of Snorri Sturluson, who is the one person to whom we owe most of what we know about Norse mythology. He wrote the Edda, he wrote Heimskringla, and there are, Valkyries and shield maids in both of these books. He gave us the standard definition of the Valkyrie, and that is a beautiful battle goddess with a shield and a sword or spear, whose job was to ferry the dead heroes to Valhalla and to serve them cups of mead. So they're kind of like glorified kitchen wenches in his book. But at the same time, as Snorri was writing, his nephew was also writing sagas. And in his nephew's book, the battle goddesses are trolls. They are ugly and they smell bad and they drizzle blood over the battlefield and they whip men's heads off with bloody rags. They are not at all, beautiful kitchen maids. Then there are also in all of the Icelandic sources, there are stories of the shield maids. So sometimes these are women who ride flying horses and they cast storms of spears. Sometimes they are giantesses. Sometimes they're real women who dress and fight like the men and among the men. So scholars have spent a lot of time going through the sources and pointing out different instances, different characters, saying, well, this one's a Valkyrie, she's supernatural, and this one's a shield maid, she's semi-human, and this one is a giant, and this one is a troll. And I thought, we don't really know what all those words mean. this idea of classifying things, of putting things in boxes, is a modern idea. It's like in biology, where we have started to define what is a species. Now, this came in the 1700s. This is not something that the Vikings had any interest in. And even when you look at the modern debates over what is a species, biologists fall into two different camps. They're what they call the lumpers, and then they're the splitters. The lumpers will join together a lot of similar animals or plants and make that a species, and the splitters want to make a whole lot of different species. So the sizes of your boxes change depending on your outlook. So I looked at this and I said, wait a minute, I'm going to redefine the word Valkyrie, and I'm going to make it as big and general as possible. So for me, for this book, a Valkyrie is a female character who has weapons or fights in a battle. So I include giantesses. Like, how do you know what a giant is? And I include elf women. Often they marry men, humans. So it's not like the giant is that big. She marries a human and has kids with him. So how can we tell them apart? So I go quite a ways from Snorri to try to come up with a broader definition of this word. And really, we have no idea if these people are mythological, if they're legendary, if they're historical, and especially when you see the images of them, the amulets and the icons that show a woman, with a sword, like the one that's on the cover of my book. This one here, yeah, you got it too. It's an inch tall. It's 1 inch tall. We have no idea what these figurines were used for. Whether they were magical, whether they were like tokens that would show you belong to a certain group or a certain army. We don't really know what they were for. And we certainly can't tell that they represent mythological characters just because the woman is carrying a sword. I think that's a really bad assumption to make.
I love that note about classification and like metaphorical language, because we use that today. Like, people call women goddesses. I get called a giant sometimes. And if someone found someone's Instagram and was like, this is a saga of the 21st century, look, they believed in goddesses. Like, that could be similar to the interpretation that people are making of Snorri.
I think so. And if you look at other things where Snorri tries to do some classification, like the elves, he has dark elves and light elves, and he mixes them up, and he forgets which one is which, and then he starts calling them dwarves, and then you can get totally confused when you're reading his text if you really think these terms are definite groups of creatures. We just really don't know what the word Valkyrie meant.
Yeah. So knowing, what you know now, and, there's still, or at least my opinion as a historical writer, and when I've been writing my worlds, is that even if there were some Viking, warrior women still had to bear children. And so even if only the childbearing was gender segregated, that still would affect people's roles in the Viking Age. So how would you define gender roles in the Viking Age?
Well, the first thing is to stop thinking about the Victorian Age, in the 1800s, when all these ideas of what Viking women could do were developed. And in the Victorian Age, the women were confined to church, children, and kitchen. That's really restricting. And I think one of the studies that really influenced me was done in 1993, I think, by Carol Clover, where she showed that people in the Viking Age really do not divide by a binary gender, in a binary gender way. They're more on a spectrum from passive to aggressive. And a woman who's very aggressive is actually respected and is actually, praised for that. And a man who is passive doesn't have to go be a Viking, is not the person you would choose to have on your boat. So I think some of these roles that, you know, we think were consigned to women, like running the household, actually could have been done by men quite well. And one of the things I tried to do in The Real Valkyrie is to pull from the sagas examples of when men are doing what we have always considered to be women's work. So in one section where there is a feast, this is actually taken from Eo's saga, the man is the one who organizes the feast and who has the role of presenting the ceremonial cup to the guests as they arrive, and things like this that we've always thought that was the woman's job. So if you look at the sagas in that way, you can find when men are doing what we call women's work. Now, some of the ways in which women had power are what we would call women's work. So one of the things that I do go into is the idea of textile work always being associated with women. And there are good reasons for that. Textile work is not only extremely important in this kind of society, it is one of the few jobs that you can do when you're pregnant, nursing, have little children underfoot that you have to watch out for, because almost every part of the process can be interrupted at any point. Another person can take over without too much loss of quality, whereas you can't really, you know, trade in and out people when you're making a sword or something like that. You know, that process cannot be interrupted. But making a sail, you know, weaving a sail, yeah, you can interrupt that. Weaving clothing, making clothing, you can interrupt that. So there seem to me good reasons why, you know, this was, you know, in the household realm. I do argue that probably they had men spinning the wool into yarn too, because you needed so much yarn to make anything, and it took so much longer than weaving that you really had to get, you know, every pair of hands that you could doing some of those jobs. But I think that we really need to stop thinking about women's work versus men's work and to think more of the spectrum. So what I would like people to be defined by is their ambition, their ability, their family ties, and their wealth. So a woman who is, you know, as this skeleton is in BJ 581, she's 5'7", so she's 2 inches taller than the average man of her time. She's almost as tall as the King of Denmark, who was thought to be tall at his time. He was 5'8". We know from the study of her bones that she ate well all her life. She never went through periods of starvation or malnutrition, so she could have been quite strong. And we know from all the weapons that were buried with her that she was very skillful. And the game pieces in her lap say she was also a good person with strategy. The horses show that she was extremely rich. To have 2 horses, almost no other graves in that graveyard, there are 3,000 of them, have even 1 horse, and she has 2. So she's somebody who falls well onto, you know, the male, aggressive side of the spectrum, whereas other people would not. So I think we really kind of need to look at people as individuals and what are their qualities. And that actually is something that when I looked for support for that idea, what came to me is that it's in Norse mythology. Snorri Sturluson didn't tell us much about the goddesses. You know, he kind of skipped, you know, half of the mythology. He told us about the gods, but he only gave us the names of a lot of the goddesses. But one thing that he did do was he gave us the Norse creation story. And it's really important to look at that carefully and compare it to the Christian creation story. Because in the Norse myth, how it begins is that there are 3 gods wandering along the seashore, and they come upon 2 driftwood logs, an elm tree and an ash tree. And they shape the wood into human shape, and they give them blood, breath, and curious minds to bring them to life. Now compare that to the Christian version, where Adam is created first, and then Eve is, he's in the image of God, and then Eve is created out of Adam's rib as, a helper and a support to him. So in the Christian myth, the woman is always secondary. But in the Norse myth, they're made at the same time out of almost the same stuff. And when you look at the two different woods that are chosen, what are they good for? Ash is good for spear shafts and oars, but elm is good for wagon wheels and hunting bows. So both the male and the female, the ash was the male and the elm was the female, both of them have uses in both peace and in war, for transportation and for killing. And I think that says a lot about how people were thought of in the Viking Age, in the pre-Christian Viking Age, which is what I'm interested in, is that they had their uses in both peace and war, and they were a team. They were complementary. One was not subordinate to the other.
I was going to ask next what you say to skeptics who try to tell you that women couldn't have behaved in the way you described, but I think you already answered that. But I've gotten so many tweets from people who've read my novels where I've Svanhild, who I don't really have wield a sword, but she does end up captaining sort of a diplomatic ship in the third book. And so many people just telling me women couldn't have behaved that way. And
well, I think absolutely they could have. And it's funny because when I knew you were going to interview me, I reread The Half-Drowned King. And my first question to you over email was, would you make Svanhild a little bit stronger, after having read my book? Because now that I see her, in as a girl in the beginning, I'm thinking, oh, I would have pushed that a little bit farther. I would, push her more toward being competent and being able, and maybe the society didn't crush her as much as you thought.
Yeah, I think I might have too. It's sort of embarrassing to me now to how seriously I took a lot of the historians' ideas, when I've also had always had the thought that, like, when people come at me with that, I'm like, well, you can't prove a negative, so you can't prove she couldn't have. And, as a historical fiction writer, I feel like I want to follow the research, but I also want to explore the possible and the probable, but not the definite. So yeah, I think I would have on the one hand. On the other hand, I was interested in kind of telling a story about a woman who was fierce, but not a warrior, because I feel like in some more mass market books about Vikings, sometimes you get rather stereotypical, like, fierce warrior woman. So I didn't want to lean too hard into that. But yeah, no, I do wish some of this research had been out there when I was first writing the book, which is back in the late 2000s when I started it.
I feel the same way about my book, The Far Traveler, which was, again, an exceptional woman. She was an explorer who went from Greenland to North America. And actually, she crossed the North Atlantic 8 times in one of these open boats. So she was really, really tough. But I also bought into that idea that she would have had to learn how to, milk the cows and make the cheese and do the weaving and all these sorts of things. And now when I look at it, I think, no, probably they would have seen her skills when she was a teenager, and she would have been given different jobs. There was no reason, in a large, family group, that everyone had to do the same thing just because that was their gender. The way I like to think of it now, probably being a woman warrior and certainly being a woman explorer was exceptional for that time. Not every woman did it, but not every man did it either. Being a leader of a Viking band was not open to just anybody. You had to be, really, really good at that. And I think it's more like today we have women who are Olympic athletes. I mean, I can't do that. We have women who are Marines. I wouldn't want to do that. We have women who swim the English Channel and run the Boston Marathon, and that's never appealed to me. But women can do it if they have the ambition, if they're willing to work hard to do it, if they acquire the skills. So why couldn't that be true in the Viking Age?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And that leads right into, what do you think that Viking history, and particularly Viking women's history, has to tell us about our own time?
Well, I think really it's that we need to question our assumptions. We need to look at, what we have been taught about the past and say, do we actually know that, or do we just assume it? And how can we find out more? And when, really controversial studies like this one of BJ 581 are published, we need to look at our own response and say, am I not believing this because I really think these scientists don't know their job? Or is it just making me uncomfortable because I had preconceived notions about, I thought I understood this period, and I thought I understood, women's roles in this period, and now I'm going to have to rethink it. And, believe me, I did an awful lot of rethinking for this book, and it was very, very hard. I mean, even down to the wording. Like, I wanted to say they manned the ship, but I got women on the ship. I can't say that, It was just like, oh my gosh, all these words that I know suddenly are not, not really useful because they work into this assumption, into this prejudice that there weren't women in the Viking bands. And now we know there's probably one, at least one, that was a leader of a Viking band. But it kind of changes everything.
Yeah. And I mean, I saw, and other than people disputing the science, I did see blog posts from historians saying things like, well, there was probably missing male bones in the grave that were missing, or the sword was actually stand-in for, was like a gift to her, or all these things. When they find wooden swords in women's graves, they've often said that rather than being a practice sword or a facsimile of a sword, it's a beater for a loom, which it could be, but it doesn't have to be.
No, it doesn't. And one of the researchers very clearly explained to me that every single elite grave from the Viking Age is different. There's no real patterns. Every single one tells a different story. And so we need to interpret them individually. And in this case, there's no question that these were working weapons, and they were arranged around this body so closely, there could not have been another body there. And there's no reason why this one grave is not a warrior's grave when the one right next to it that has a male skeleton and looks the same way, is also called a warrior's grave. So, you have to either reinterpret all of them, or you have to accept this as a woman warrior.
Yeah, well, I would agree. And I hope to write more Viking fiction with more sword wielding women and feel better about it.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to, or turn it over to questions from the audience soon. But before we do that, I just wanted to know if there's anything else you wanted to tell readers about the book.
No, I think we covered it, Linnea.
Okay, great.
I'm curious to see what other people are going to ask.
So we do have our first audience question has come in from Janine, and anyone else who has questions, please type them in the chat. She asks, do you think that the Vikings TV show is historically accurate, since they have the shield maidens fighting alongside the male warriors and traveling with them? She says, I love how it portrays men and women ruling together and separately.
I think that there's a lot in the Vikings that is historical, and I think they were really, ahead of the curve, because this study came out, while they were producing the show. And if you look at, for instance, the character of Lagertha in the very beginning, and I've looked at this scene over and over again, the very first episode of the TV show, they sort of start out with the classic Viking raid coming into the village, and you see all the women and children running, and the big hairy guys are burning down buildings and killing everybody. And the camera focuses in on this beautiful blonde woman, and she tells her children, go hide. And the two men come into her house, and they, I thought, oh, great. Now we're going to start with a rape scene, classic Viking drama. And no, she picks up the poker out of the fire, and she beats these guys up. She puts them on the ground. And it's the most wonderful scene for really making us reassess our assumptions, because she is, Catherine Winnick, who plays Lagertha, is in real life a martial artist. She's a mixed martial artist. She has such a beautiful sense of where her body is in space and exactly how much force she needs to use. and how to use the attacker's force against her, she has no trouble taking care of these two big hulks who all they have is strength. And it very clearly shows, this could be done. Now, when you look at the sources for Lagertha, she appears in Saxo Grammaticus, History of the Danes from the 1200s, and she is described almost exactly the way they do in the TV show. She is a real historical character, if you can wrap your mind around the idea that women warriors were real historical characters, which even Saxo couldn't wrap his mind around. But if you think of it, I mean, a lot of what the History Channel does is fiction. I mean, a lot of it is dramatization. They're telling a good story. They get things wrong, like what people wore. But basically, I think their approach is really good, and I think it's something that we need to face up to, that we need to think about. Is like, well, men and women lived at that time, and they probably worked things out in ways that we haven't yet understood.
I'm so glad that you mentioned clothing too, because one of the things that drives me crazy about most medieval and Dark Ages historical fiction is they make everyone grimy and drab. And one of the things I loved about your book is you describe some of the amazing outfits that
oh my gosh,
that your Viking woman that we know she had. I don't know if you want to spoil it for people, but like her winged captain is just
it's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, Vikings actually liked bright colors, and they liked silk, and they used the silk in like patchwork and applique and clashing colors. It's just amazing. Their embroidery with silver thread and sequins, mirrored sequins. So it's not the dark drab, everything out of wool that we think of it, but it's also not what the History Channel does with the leather and the fur and their approach is more modern goth than actual Viking. But there's Vikings of Iceland who didn't have as much most of our sources coming from Iceland, but in Iceland they didn't have much access to silk. It came from far away, whereas this woman was buried in Sweden. She was at the end of essentially the Silk Road in the Viking Age, so she had a lot more opportunity to dress up.
This actually touches on a question that I have, sort of both of these answers about clothes and about the village raid. What are some of the Viking stereotypes that drive both of you the most crazy? Some of your least favorite stereotypes?
Well, right now it's the passive and defenseless woman, because I think that in a society that is a martial society, which the Vikings were, and a slave trading society in which if you lose the battle, your people become slaves, they were certainly going to teach their girls some battle skills. I mean, they would at least be able to shoot a bow and arrow. I was in Norway or Sweden and Denmark. They would probably know some fighting moves. They certainly could protect themselves a little bit more than what you see in the classic Viking story, where the women are protected by the men. And it's like, no, the men were not there. The women protected themselves. So that's the one that bothers me most now is that passive, feminine type.
And I would like more people to know about the links between the Viking world and the Arab world, the trade links, and actually the fact that one of the great sources that we have for Viking histories are the Arab explorers like Ibn Fadlan, and people I think attribute racism, which is also a much later invention, to the Vikings. Where they did like take slaves, but it's not in the same way that we think of and it was very brutal and violent, but it wasn't like chattel slavery in the Americas in the colonial age. But I see we have some more questions, so I don't want to.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a really good point, though. I think we need to talk about the difference between the slavery in the Viking Age. Anybody could become a slave. So the king's son can become a slave. but the slave can also become a king. And we have several stories of that happening.
Thanks. The next question is from Audrey. She says, what would the Christian enemies have thought of these Valkyries?
Yeah. When Christianity came into the Viking Age, that's when you see women's roles changing. And in Iceland, it took about 200 years for the church to completely change the understanding of what women's roles were and what women were like. When the Vikings became Christian in the year 1000, those ideas weren't really part of Christianity. There was not this sense of social control in the Christian hierarchy until the 1100s and 1200s. So this was something that was growing, but had not yet spread throughout the Christian world, that women had to be put in their place. I mean, things like marriage and baptism were not rights. They were not controlled by the church. There was no sense of illegitimacy and of children not being able to inherit in the year 1000 when the Vikings accepted Christianity. So this is something that was all changing during the time that the stories were being written down. And that's one of the hardest things that we have in interpreting the sources on the Viking period, especially those from Iceland, because they were all written by Christians. The Icelandic sagas, Snorri Sturluson was a Christian, the myths were all written down by Christians. And so we should have to peel back some of those layers and see, okay, what's underneath them? What are they telling us?
So there's another follow-up question from Janine asking, were female children valued the same way as male children?
We have no idea. We can't find any graves, of infants. They're really, really rare. So we can't do any statistical studies on where there are more, female infants that were killed or male infants killed. And so there is a lot of discussion in the Viking studies field about whether girl children were put out to exposed is the word, put out on the hillside to die. And there's not really a lot of actual fact, a lot of actual data that this could have happened. So it's kind of your interpretation of a few sentences in the sagas and in the histories about children being killed. And we do know that in the pagan world, the pagan Scandinavian world, that was essentially a form of birth control. If you could not afford to raise a child, if it was a period of famine or hunger, you would put the child outside to die. And we don't really know if more women were killed or more men. Probably they didn't want to do it in either case.
Thank you, Nancy. There's been a sort of Vikings have had kind of a moment here in the last few years. What do you ascribe that to? Has something changed in our culture? I mean, why are we more excited about Vikings and maybe since Wagner or something?
Well, I kind of blame it all on J.R.R. Tolkien. He's actually why I got interested in Vikings, because he was a specialist in Icelandic sagas and in Old Norse. And when I wanted to find out where he got his ideas and how he, became a great writer, I started reading what he studied and what he was interested in. And when the Lord of the Rings movies came out, I mean, that was a big cultural moment. Suddenly, fantasy became really popular. If you look at modern fantasy, even including Game of Thrones and, the Vikings TV show and all that kind of stuff, that really grows out of Tolkien, and Tolkien really grows out of Snorri Sturluson. So it's the Viking sagas that have kind of gone through fantasy back to history now and gotten people interested in that again.
I'm going to steal that answer next time I'm asked, because I was raised like knowing I descended from Vikings and raised with the myths from the Edda. So I'm like, Vikings have always been big. Yeah. It's not new.
Well, it
So-
wasn't true for me. I mean, and I have like no Scandinavian heritage, so I had to look back and say, okay, how did I get interested in this? And then to see, how a lot of people may have. I mean, if you look at Eowyn in the Lord of the Rings, I mean, she is a Viking warrior woman.
And the movies did such a great job in the horse people, the Rohan, all the styling of Rohan
Right.
was really, really based on like the feasting halls and the burial mounds. It's very, very
Mhm.
evocative.
And it's right from the sagas,
Yeah.
That's where Tolkien got all this, and that's why I like it.
And you read Heimskringla and you find like guys wandering around named Gandalf, and it's like, hey, what's he doing here?
Yeah. What's he doing there? Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm afraid we're out of time, but it has been a wonderful event. Wow, absolutely fascinating. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, David and
The,
Rachel.
the book is The Real Valkyrie. You can order it at the links in the chat, and the Golden Wolf Saga as well. We'll see you at another Northshire Presents virtual event soon, and then hopefully, in person again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all and have a
Thank
great
you,
night.
everyone.
Thank you.